Looks like it's kind of populating. Now we can see it. At least I can.
All right, thank you for that. All right, Title 32, Title 48. So if anyone has a hard time sleeping at night, if you want to read the full regs, here is the links to them, govinfo.gov, and then Title 48 at federalregister.gov until final passing, which again, as Pierre mentioned, is scheduled for first quarter this year. A little bit about me. No, I'm not selling, but just want to at least tell you who I am. Again, I'm a CCA, CCP, some other certs there. I've been part of it says 10, but I've been over 12 joint surveillances last year, 2024. I'm also a FedRAMP assessor with multiple FedRAMP assessments. I've been trained by the Cyber AB themselves. Been part of the cyber ecosystem, the CMMC Cyber AB ecosystem since the beginning as a provisional assessor. I personally have over 20 some years in cybersecurity. And then here's some of the small companies I worked for personally on helping their CMMC compliance. So again, what is CMMC? I know a lot of people know what it is, but I always like to start this slide because this is what the mission is, and trying to show what the little tongue-in-cheek of anyone see the problem here. The F-35 compared to the J-31 from China. Of course, our Humvees, and they're knockoffs of us. So this is the mission. I support the mission. We're getting our intellectual property stolen. And since 2017, the Department of Defense has realized that and has enforced their supply chain to beef up their cybersecurity standards. Since 2017, everyone in the supply chain said, yes, we're good. We meet NIST 800-871. A couple of years later, 2020, DoD said, okay, we need to put another program in here to have third-party verification and validation, hence CMMC. We're here to try to enforce, or to, not enforce, but in fact to regulate and make sure to verify that the supply chain is meeting NIST 800-171 cybersecurity standards. So the current model is only 3 levels. Level 1 is FCI. Level 2 is CUI, controlled unclassified information. Again, Pierre, I'm sorry, I need to watch my abbreviations because I know there's tons of acronyms. So I'll try to watch myself. But control unclassified information and federal contract information. Level 3, if you're a supplier or have a customer that is level 3 and they don't know, they would already know if they're level 3, as those assessments are performed by DIPCAC DCMA solely. Level 2 is performed mainly by C3POs like ourselves for CUI, and then level 1 is usually self-attestation for SPUR system. So, have any questions so far before I keep going?
There was one item, John, if you could make it a little bigger, if you can
Sure.
go full screen on it, I think it'd be appreciated.
Went to a different screen. I knew that was going to happen. Is that better, Matt?
Yeah, that's a little better for me, hopefully. Yep.
Okay. All right, so a little more breakdown of those different levels of assessments. Again, level 1 self-test. It doesn't require a POAM, and after each assessment, it's required that the OSC puts their information in the SPUR system, which is supplier performance risk system. If anyone here didn't know that, I probably should put a link onto the SPUR system and PIEE. But basically, that's the contract award management system that is issuing contracts for work for level 2 or level 1. And I'll get into a little bit more about Title 48. Level 2 is bifurcated. There's a self-assessment. So some contracts will allow organizations to self-attest at level 2 even. Based on a contract, they're required to annually affirm into SPURS, and then every 3 years have a conditional CMMC status date. POEMs will be closed out in 180 days, but this is all again it's self-reporting system. There's be a majority of contracts will have the requirement for the C3PO verification. CP3 verifications right now is every 3 years, and that basically means we'll do an assessment at the OSC, and then we'll enter it to score in the SPURS, and then actually in the EMAS. The EMAS ties in the SPURS.
So what's the difference between the self and they're both on level 2, but what differentiates them?
Right,
Where does that derive from?
the contract will specify. So
Okay.
the flow down requirements from your prime will specify if they have to do a level 2 assessment with a C3PO, then that is flow down to the supply chain as well. It's a great question. That's a great question. And again, level 3, the government will contact you for your level because your contracts are mission critical to
Yeah.
infrastructure, mission, space applications, nuclear, and I think satellites. So those are rare, and there's much fewer contracts requesting at that level.
Well, and just as Alan, as a rule of thumb, just on the sense, it's a level 2 self-attestation are typically non-national defense or critical national defense related information, like PII or things like that, but the level 2 that require independent will impact national defense. So that's the key differentiator between the two.
That's also with level
So
3. Level 3 is national defense contracts.
Yeah, and then that obviously extends to level 3, but the difference between self-attesting at level 2 and independent C3PAO assessments would be based on sensitivity of information.
Which is specified in the contract, correct?
yeah, I think so. Alan, you're saying that the rule of thumb is basically if we're dealing with items such as were shown in the picture earlier, John, right? So if we're dealing with those kinds of items or anything that's, kind of contributing to that, we're more than likely going to be, C3PAO assessed, not be doing self-assess. Whereas if you're kind of handling CUI, but you're not dealing with national defense items, you're kind of there's an option there in the contract as long as it's all kind of laid out well, where self-assessment is sufficient.
Yes, but I think when Title 48 passes, and this is some personal opinion, this is not stated anywhere. I believe contract officers will probably slap that Title 48 requirement on their contracts requiring a third-party verification. I can see them doing that just because I've seen them misalign or mislabel CUI already in contracts and flow down requirements. So that's why any advice I would give to anyone listening to the call is always follow the contract. Even if the contract is wrong, you're legally bound to that contract that you signed. Instead of making the decision of I don't think my product here is CUI that's
No, of course, of
right.
course.
That's
Yeah,
what
no, I don't think I think we can all say we are not lawyers here and we're not contract officers, right? But I think it's just the rule of thumb to give people some context around kind of what that difference is.
I agree, but that's just trying to why I always say officially. Yeah, I
Yeah,
understand.
officially it's in the contract, but yeah, no, that's interesting. All right.
You can't go wrong legally by saying I followed the contract.
Agreed. Yep.
Yeah. All right. So some requirements and major changes that occurred from the Title 32 rule that's happened and are in place. So if a prime contract requires a C3PO assessment, like I mentioned already, all subs will be required a third-party assessment. That was a major shift from previous, level 2 self-attestation. There's been talk from the DoD to the CyberB that the DoD will eventually move away from self-assessments. That kind of, to me, makes sense because this whole self-assessment program's been kind of going in place since 2017 and hasn't been working out so well for the DoD protecting their data for the supply chain. All organizations, again, must affirm to SPURS annually of their state of compliance. Affirmation by a senior professional that can represent the company is liable. So their signature, their stamp, so to speak, is telling the government that they are validating that their company meets these requirements. Another big news, obviously, was if you've been following CMMC for a little bit, if an OSA utilizes an external service provider, including cloud service providers that does not process, store, or transmit CUI, that external service provider does not require its own CMMC assessment. There was talks recently over the last year on how that was going to be enforced, and the DoD for the final rule couldn't really enforce that on organizations or companies that don't have government contracts themselves. MSPs, suppliers, MSPs are everywhere with IT and the OSA data, so it's kind of hard to enforce government rules on companies that don't have contracts. So that was actually a big relief to a lot of suppliers in the supply chain. And then the last thing here is the services provided by external service providers are assessed as part of the OSC's assessment as security protection assets. And we'll talk a little bit later about the different asset classes. Any questions here? Or everyone pretty much probably is aware of this right now, but like to ask at the end of each slide. Nope.
Well, I have one quick question. How do they deal with accountability, right? So if subcontract, and pardon me, by the way, I know little about this topic, but if the subcontractor doesn't have the requirement, right? Who's accountable for any kinds of incidents or, leaks? I mean, I understand that there's no CUI data, but that's just sort of one stipulation. What happens if there's a problem with the cloud provider, a cloud provider, or what have you? Who's accountable for that?
Okay, so you're saying as far as if a third-party cloud provider is, say they have a SIM to the OSC, and they have a breach or an issue?
Exactly.
Okay, so that still is, as long as the CUI is not there. So if it's CUI to that cloud provider has to be FedRAMP moderate.
Okay.
That's the requirement for that. If that external service provider or cloud provider does not have CUI, then they don't have to be FedRAMP moderate. I would think at that point, the normal SLAs will be in effect as far as between the company and that provider. If a breach happens, they're liable, probably some legal language to that effect. But as far as the government's concerned, the CUI data is not there. CMMC is focusing solely on FCI and CUI.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
I just want to kind of add on that. The prime contractor is always going to be primarily accountable. If it's a subcontractor breach, that's where the government will hold accountability for any breach, particularly with CUI or FCI. So that's why prime contractors and prime contractors have to ensure that their subcontractors are compliant. However, there's different ways of mitigating that. One way would be keep them in your environment that's already been certified, meaning a subcontractor would work within the prime's environment. Or second option, or another option, is the subcontractor has their own certified environment. Or another approach is the subcontractor is assessed under the prime contractor's environment. So there's 3 different options you can take there. So, but ultimately, per the CFR, the prime contractor is always accountable for the subs.
So they would want to have some sort of special provisions placed into their contracts to protect themselves, I would think.
Who would?
The prime to the sub. That's
they can't say, oh, sorry, we're not accountable. They are accountable. They can't put a contract in a subcontract that says, oh, we're not taking any liability on you guys. They are accountable by the government. So the government will say, look, any penalties will be on you. on the prime. And the sub obviously is going to be penalized as well if something terrible happens. But the prime contractor is always accountable. You can't subcontract that away. But
Yeah,
they're going to be accountable.
that's why the subprimes, Keith, and you know, please, you said you didn't know much about it. That's why we're here, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah.
I love that you're open to kind of ask these questions. It's great, but that's why the subprimes get assessed by the primes, right? That's why they've got to follow all these rules, is to reduce this risk around this because they're everyone's liable in this chain. You know, the subprimes might lose their contracts, right? That's the threat, but the prime is going to go, as Alan is sharing, right? The prime is going to be ultimately responsible, and that's who the government's going to go after. So that's why they come in and everyone needs to be compliant. That's the whole point of this ecosystem. So yeah.
Yeah.
No, very good. Well, thank you for that. Thank you.
Yes, it's the DFARS flow down requirements. That's what we're talking about. Everything's flowed down to the subs as far as CUI and FCI. That's absolutely correct.
Yep.
I was given an example of a third party vendor that doesn't have CUI,
Exactly. That was my target. That's the
Yeah.
target of my question.
which is different because the government that's outside the government thing, that's out of their control. It's outside DFARS. It's in scope. It's in scope for the assessment. You're definitely we're going to look at, who you have as far as your, SIM vendor, vulnerability scanners, any other tool that's connected to your system. That's definitely in scope of the assessment. But as far as if they got breached, that's a whole different, because they're not really, again, if it's not CUI, that's a little different. Does that make sense? Alan,
It does.
Alan,
It does
Alan,
to an extent. I just don't know how clear the CUI, right? Like, it seems like you either dealing with CUI or you're not dealing with CUI. And, in my experience, sometimes it's a little bit gray, whether you're dealing with CUI or not. I'm not sure how clear that is and whether that's,
that's a big question too. What is
yeah.
CUI?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, it's a
That's
huge.
a lot.
I,
Huge.
I always say scoping is the hardest part of this. So you're tapping
Yeah.
into something that is probably the thing that I've spent the most time thinking through, Keith, in terms of
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
what matters. Yeah, no, it's a huge question. Where it all lands has been, honestly, it's gone all over the place, right? It's been up and down over the last however many years we've all been trying to go through this. But yeah, you're tapping into a lot of the questions around where does this land, right? So does something that controls access to CUI, is that CUI?
Well, I think John
But
said it in a previous slide. This is all bound under contract. It's specified under contract. So the contract says you've got CUI, and you're not going to parse out, oh, well, this was a recipe from somebody's, bakery. You're not going to parse out that information. You're going to protect that information as if it's CUI under contract. Plain and simple. And it doesn't matter if it's of low sensitivity or high sensitivity, as I mentioned earlier, there's distinctions. But you have to say, I've got to protect it. If I've got a contract and it says CUI, level 2, I'm going to basically, or even level 3, I've got to protect it. That's what we're focusing on, because if you start looking at, well, I can't tell the difference between, you probably aren't under contract and you don't need to protect it. I mean, you should, but you don't need to because you're not bound under any agreements. So I think that's really going to be the first place to start. Think of this as starting with the contract. This is an acquisition program that has security requirements in it. The requirements are going to be secondary to the acquisition itself. So you have a contract, specify CUI, you move into the next phase, which is now we perform our activities under terms of that contract, but I'm not going to be worrying about every little piece of information if my environment is secure. Does that help, hopefully, with?
Yes. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's a big can of worms there, Keith, about going to NARA and CUI registry and then verifying that with a contract with CUI. That's a very common issue with, like Matt just said, about scoping. You can't protect what you don't know what you're protecting. So
we
you
have
have
a we have a hand up here too.
Okay.
John Archana, if you want to just.
Yeah. Thank you, Matt and John. Sorry, I'm also new to this, and we are subprime. Prime contractor is some other company affiliated with government, and we are in medical device manufacturing. So a lot of our devices does not hold, process, or transmit any personally identifiable information. But could this also be considered as a flow down requirement just to ensure that we as subcontractor are able to supply them what we tell them we'll supply, whether or not there is a requirement for us, if we sell scalpel or headlamp, we sell a little more than that. Does that apply to us? Because if our environment is breached, we might not be able to provide them the supplies that is required for the government. How does that apply? Because I'm a bit confused. Contractual information is not, we're still trying to parse through it to figure out if they can send us the language that is in FCI in a way that, they don't have to give us the whole thing, but how does it apply to us? What are you looking from us to do? And how do we start that process? So I have read a lot of document, but still a bit confused on what it is, how does it apply, and where is that first step where I begin? Like, let's say I want to do a self-assessment, and that's why I posted the question that where do I begin? Like, if I want to do ISO 27001, I have a matrix. I go by, do you have this policy? Do you have this process? Do you have this procedure? I do all that. Where do I go to start that process in CMMI if I
Okay,
want to do a self-assessment?
two things there,
Sorry,
real quick.
Question.
Two things there real quick. If you're selling things that may be commercial off the shelf items, like a scalpel that you can sell to anyone, to a Walmart, and not just DoD, that may be classified as COTS, which was not CUI. If you're in doubt of if that is CUI or not, I would definitely ask your contracting officer. They need to tell you.
We're waiting to hear back, John, on that. But we do have one new medical device that does hold software. We're trying to figure out if it holds any personally identifiable information. It's for like ENT surgery and whatnot with the new acquisition. But for the rest of the stuff, we don't hold any data. So the flow down requirement is not really on supply chain per se. It's only if you have FCI or CUI.
Right.
So if you get breached and if you're not able to provide them the goods, it's okay because you're not holding. It does not apply to you. Will I be correct in saying that?
That sounds like COTS.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but let's clarify a little bit about COTS. Here's the key difference within COTS. COTS is typically not covered under, it's probably FCI if the government provides you specifications for the modification of that COTS software or hardware or product or supply. If the government provides you specifications under contract, it's probably FCI. Now, is it going to be CUI? Probably not. I'll tell you why, because you're not modifying it. You're not modifying the product sufficiently. Otherwise, it becomes custom built for the government, even custom modified. So it's no longer COTS. It's I can't buy it. But COTS in itself can be considered FCI if the government gives you tweaking requirements. And I only know this because we were working with an OSA who had basically calipers, and these were calipers you can buy anywhere. But then they gave them specifications around calipers, around, hey, this is the specifications of what these calipers have to measure and how they have to work. And they gave them specifications. So they had to tweak their COTS package, and that then it became FCI. So you have to be mindful. You have to read the contract. And if the government gives you specifications, it's probably FCI. And unless they're asking you to modify your software, your hardware, your product to a degree that you cannot commercially sell it, like as such, and it's only specified for the government, and the government might claim some propriety over it, it's CUI. So unless they do that, it's probably not. So I would probably say in your case, the way you described it probably sounds like might be FCI, but don't know yet until you say, well, the
Thank you,
government
Alan.
actually
This
gives
is
specifications.
very informative. Understanding what could be FCI, even if it's COTS, right? A scalpel, a headlamp, right? But if it is not FCI, can the prime contractor still hold us accountable, although it's no contractual language, but because they are under the gun that we supply to them, they will hold us accountable to the same standard.
That's why I said
Yeah.
that's why I said reference them. Contact them directly and get in writing if they said that that contract is CUI or not. But
Okay.
the liability is on them to make sure that you're getting the right information. You are not supposed to make that determination yourself. You're taking
No,
the risk. You're
totally.
taking the risk if you are.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you. And also maybe during the course, or I'll send a message, where do I begin? Because I'll probably be involved in trying to start that self-assessment process with some help.
Hey, here's a
Sure.
consideration. Here's a consideration, because I do agree there that, don't do this in a vacuum. You have to actually have some advice. However, there's also the consideration that you are on the hook because you might, under contract, you might inadvertently create CUI and you're not aware. If the minute you say this is information that has to be protected, it has to be safeguarded against dissemination. You have to have these controls in place. They follow the CUI workflow, which you may, it's available. I think I posted the link to the Narrow website. If it follows those rules, you may have created CUI even though you may not be aware of it. So be mindful. You can create it, not be aware of it, but then once you are aware of it, you better notify your contracting officer, because then they'll mark it. It's basically the government will be the ones responsible for owning it. You'll be responsible for safeguarding it. They're responsible for taking ownership, dissemination controls, and the like. So it's a little bit of a tricky slope there, but now you're pushing it all the way up to CUI and not necessarily just commercial off-the-shelf products.
Outstanding stuff.
And her second part of the question was, how do we get started to protect CUI? That's NIST 800-171 is the guiding document that controls CUI for CMMC. And we can send a link to you, someone, I don't see the chat, but to where to get the documents from the DoD site or the Cyber AB site.
I think someone already shared it. There's you can go through kind of a self-assessment process to kind of start that process.
Yeah, I
think that was
popped
the
it online.
question.
It's
Alan did.
the archives.gov and /CUI, really easy to get to. It has everything you need, including the CUI registry. There's even CUI training there. So ISOO is the Information Security Oversight Office is the authority around CUI for all federal agencies, including the DoD. So you might want to go there and the training's free. They're not really heavy training, but there's a marking handbook. There's also access to the 32 CFR, the Executive Order 13556. Everything's in there around CUI. So that might be a good place to start.
And also, I mean, again, everyone, don't be afraid. If you have questions not getting answers here because of the time crunch, shoot us an email, right? And we will definitely respond to you.
Yep.
Okay, John.
Okay. So this is actually from the DoD site, but now we're getting to about Title 48 a little bit. So Title 48 again is coming out in a couple months here. The DoD says this is four phases of implementation. But I always like to highlight big arrow, red. Some procurements may already have CMMC requirements in advance of the planning phases. I stress this because I have clients right now that have seen that from their primes. There's been some debate as how legal that is. Again, I'm not a lawyer. I don't know if any lawyers on here, but I think DoD gives himself a way out by saying this little line here made it public, and again, the contract officers already slapped that on there on contracts. So be advised that I think if you are in a DIB, you could see this on your contracts sooner than this phase rollout plan. Which is, again, you have to be required. The big deal about that is that you have to already be compliant with CMMC before you get a contract award. That's the big deal. So if you have a system or if you have a client that doesn't have their self-attestation or the required C3PAO third-party attestation, you're almost behind the 8 ball now because it's on its way. And the DoD's they were kind of quiet for a couple of years, but this has been coming for at least 2020. So I'm not trying to scare anyone, but it takes a while to implement CMMC through your proper scope of your boundary. So Title 48 is it's really here already, but this is the phase rollout, quote unquote. Any questions about the contract applicability for CMMC on defense contracts or POs? Has anyone seen that on their POs yet? Okay. Back to Title 32, there was some new terminology that I kind of wanted to specify or at least highlight. The operational plan of action for 3.12.2 is a new thing compared to last. It was POAM. So I want to specify or at least stress that the POAM now is only in regards to the assessment process, and if there is a finding during the assessment that is POAM eligible for the 180 days, that's a POAM. Operational plan of action is mainly how is the company or the OSC managing temporary vulnerabilities or temporary deficiencies, which can be, again, that's outside the assessment. That's just the normal control now.
There's a little bit of a distinction though, because the new updated CAP, the CMMC assessment process, says that anything after the end of phase 2 that is not met, and they don't care whether it's a 1-pointer or a 5-pointer, anything that's regarded as not met goes into a POAM. Now there's a 10-day window to remediate, because there's at the end of the phase 2 where you conduct the assessment, and the out brief, there's 10 days, but they have that much time to fix them. If not, then they go into 6-month POAM.
Right. You're explaining the assessment process.
Right.
Compared to the operational plan of action now has been renamed that because it's focusing on temporary vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
The control name changed.
Yeah, they could have operational plans of action, but they cannot exceed the 1-pointers. And that would be kind of like a key rule. It has to be small enough that they can fix quickly. That doesn't go into a POAM.
There's a question from a Douglas Candle, like what's POAM eligible? I think you just mentioned it, Alan. It's the 1-pointers, right? Those are the only things that can be POAM'd, as it were.
Well, the way it's written, it's anything that does not meet, that receives a score of not met, goes into the POAM. And that's, and again, whether or not they are qualified to receive a certification level is dependent on what's in that POAM when the final briefing occurs. So it's a little bit of a trick because they were much more specific before, but now they're not as specific and they're leaving a lot of things up to interpretation. But the interpretation is probably going to be, you've got 10 days to fix or to provide evidence that those things that we registered as not met are met before we do the final briefing. If you do a final briefing and we say, sorry, you did not meet the requirements because you're not getting a certification, and that would be based on the rules of the DoD methodology, the scoring methodology.
So what you're saying is anything can go in a POAM, really, but in order to be certified, there are only certain things that can be on a POAM right now.
Yeah, you can't do any 5-pointers. Anything that would, with no 5-pointers, you can't have any of those. Only most of the 3-pointers, yes, and by and large, all 1-pointers. But 1-pointers are simple things. They're like things I didn't sign my policy and things like that. I didn't have enough evidence. They're the simple things. They shouldn't even walk into an assessment with that, but you never know. I actually walked into our assessment with, I actually named the file draft, but I gave them the final, but I didn't change the file name. So they said, you've got to fix that. You've got to re-upload it. They gave me a whole bunch of hassle just around the file name. So that's a 1-pointer, and they let me fix it.
So Alan, so for the POAM versus the operational plan of action, one of the things that stood out for me in that was that they give you X amount of time for the POAMs, right? 180 days. But for the operational plan of action, what do they say? Like there's no time limit because it's a temporary.
Oh, no. You still got 10 days. You've only got 10 days.
Just wanted to figure that out. Yeah, go ahead.
The C3PAO has 10 days. So I might say, hey, I'm done with the assessment. Here's your score. And you've got 3 1-point deficiencies. Well, they've got to put into an OPA. And it also goes into a POAM. But their OPA says, we're fixing this in 2 days. Okay, well, then I might push out my outbrief for 5 or 6 days later. It's going to be dependent on the conversation. But, if you throw in a 5-pointer there at the end of the assessment, you're not even going to pass this phase. You're not going to pass phase 3. You're not going to get a poem. You've got to reapply for certification. So there's going to be little nuances there, and those nuances are the things that are going to be driven by the CAP and primarily the lead assessor and their knowledge of what that point mechanism is. And by the way, the point mechanism is in the CMMC assessment process. I'll pause and
Yeah.
I'll give you the link for the materials so that
We
way you
got two
guys all have
questions.
access.
We got two questions. What defines what is poem eligible, and what if the items what if it takes longer than 10 days to remediate what's in the poem and the OPA?
I'm going to give you that right now. The
So-
first one. I'm going to
yeah.
pop that in. That's in the link. The CMMC resources and documentation gives you everything. Those are all the documents that an assessment team will be using in order to perform their assessment. So everything from the CMMC 101 brief all the way down to the hashing guide. And there's also a great additional resources there that links you to the DFARS, the proposed schedule, the rule, and all that stuff. It's all there. But the first one, internal resources, is what are specific to CMMC.
And John, you were going to say something, John?
No, that was on my next slide here. So
Okay.
it actually has all here's items that cannot be in the poem. And then talk about the 1 point and 3 point values that Alan just mentioned. So, but overall, you don't want to go into an assessment trying not to get full 110 compliance. That's my best advice. If you do that, then you don't have to worry about if you meet the 80% criteria or if this can be on a poem or this can't be on a poem. I strongly recommend organizations, everyone just plan to go for full 110 and that you meet it before you even call a C3PAO. We don't want to do a delta or a assessment or a poem assessment. You don't want that. If you're going for an assessment, probably because you have a timeline that you're trying to meet for a contract. So you want to get it done and over with. So do we. So the idea of poems to me personally is, I wish it wasn't there. Just because it really isn't. You have to get a full 110 anyways. So it's just how fast you want to do it. I suggest do it all at once up front. But good conversation, good questions.
I think we're running a little low on time, right, Pierre?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we got about 6 minutes left, so I want to give that time to John to like 3 more minutes or so to kind of maybe bring some more stuff in terms of differentiating what it means in terms, because Title 32 was for every single federal agency, right? And Title 48 is kind of specific. So if we can bring that kind of differentiator to light for the audience, so that they can get a much better understanding of why everyone keeps talking about Title 32 versus Title 48 and what it means in terms of the contracts and the federal agencies versus the DoD.
Great. So I grabbed this from the publicly town halls that the CyberAB host. That covers Title 32. It's an official DoD program. It went into effect. This is now part of the Federal Register. It's been codified. That does apply to all federal contractors in the DIB. Title 48 is currently in proposed rule. Let me get my scroll down. That will implement CMMC program in all DoD contracts. It gives the direction to DoD contracting officers and program managers, which is why I keep saying, when in doubt, contact your contracting officer. That's kind of been my theme this past hour. So if anything else you learn from me, I hope that's it. When in doubt, contact your contract officer. The public comment period is already open. It's going to be finalized here pretty soon. And here's the little timeline that shows that projecting March 2025 after the new Congress is sworn in.
So in the first quarter, they kept saying early in 2025, but it looked like they're aiming for the last part of the first quarter.
I don't know if this is 100%, because I know I've seen this before, and I think our timeline is CMMC is in effect. They have to start writing them into the contracts, any of the new ones that come out. I think there have been 2 that I've seen that have already had them written in sloppily, I'll say. They were written in a very sloppy way. but they're factoring in that they basically have to start writing them in. So if you're thinking CMMC is not in effect, it is in effect. It's not waiting until March. Contracting officers are now being required to basically make sure that they're in new solicitations that required CMMC or require level 2 protections. So you know, the March thing, I would probably say we're already knee deep into it. You know, whether it goes into full force, that's a different story. I don't think that the ecosystem has sufficient supply of resources to do all these certifications. But you know, hey, that's good for us, good for you guys. Although I'll be honest with you, I think that they're becoming a lot more strict with the certification requirements, but you know, that's par for the course. So you
Right.
know, I see all the dates coming through. I think right now we are in it. They're required to be in effect by for next year's solicitations 100%. I think today now they're allowing some, you know, wiggle room, but come September, you're not going to see any solicitations from the DoD without those requirements built in.
Again, which means, yes, I agree 100%, Alan. I mentioned that before here with this slide, pointing that out, and that I want to also stress that you have to have your level 2 certification done before contracts are awarded to you. So that's the big push. And with that, I'll send it back to Matt and Pierre or Alan. Thanks you guys for having me here.
Hey, thank you, John. And again,
Yeah, thank you, John.
it was great having you. So to the audience again, we do this and we you know, we want everyone to participate. And again, if you have questions that can't get answered because of the crunch of time that we have in the 60 minutes, please email us. We will respond to you because that's the reason why we're here. And we're only going to continue to grow and expand what we do and what we offer in terms of the marketing and in terms of having everybody be able to network and so on. So again, we want to thank you for being here. And we look forward to having you again on our next edition for next month. So thank you, everyone. Thanks again, John,
Thank you.
Matt, Alan, and everyone that participated. Have a
Thank
good night.
you.
Bye.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to give you a call.
Okay, thanks.
All right. Bye.
All right. Good night, everyone.